This is the recorded video for LoveCanal. I'm having to redo the first couple of slides because apparently they did not save. So this is showing us where LoveCanal is. It was a small town situated along the Niagara River in upstate New York. So it is not too far away from Niagara Falls. So LoveCanal started as an idea for hydroelectricity. William Love was an industrialist in the 1880s, and he had planned to build a model city named after himself. And this model city was going to help provide homes for all of the people in industry in the area here. And they needed more area to live in, but one of the things that they didn't have was a good way of producing enough electricity. So he decided that he would build a canal between the upper and lower Niagara rivers, and that this canal could then be used to generate hydroelectricity, thus supplying additional electricity and jobs to the city. However, he ran out of money, and there were some economic downturns, so he could not complete this. In the end, he had dug a canal. It was 1 mile long, 50 feet wide, and ranged from 10 to 40 feet deep, depending upon where you are in the canal. The canal area and around it became a recreational area. Later, we'll see this canal becomes filled in. This is showing you an overview of where the canal was really built. You can see there's a red arrow pointing to the area where the canal was. So our story does not end there, of course. The canal was left over and he really didn't have anything to do with it. He'd kind of gone bankrupt. So he sold the canal to the city, Niagara Falls, in 1920s to be used as a dump site. The city and other people then would dispose of waste into LoveCanal. It was a dugout area in the ground, made a perfect landfill location. In 1942, Hooker Chemical Company purchased LoveCanal. They also used the canal for getting rid of their waste supplies. They dumped at least 22,000 tons of toxic chemicals there in a 10-year time period. However, they were not the only people dumping chemicals there. Not only had the city dumped chemicals, but so did the federal government. There were some records of what was dumped there, but not entirely good records. Most of what was put there were in drums, and these drums were buried in the ground. They were put in the canal, lined up. Then they put a layer of dirt and other things on it. And we found that the canal itself was full. At this point in time, they'd put dirt on top. They had then grown grass on top of it. And Hooker Chemical Company really had no use for it anymore because they couldn't dump any more waste there. The Niagara Falls Board of Education decided to purchase LoveCanal in 1953 from Hooker Chemical Company. What happened is that the Niagara Falls School Board needed to have another area for more schools. The town was growing, so they needed to be able to build more schools to keep up with the needs of the population. They approached Hooker. Hooker said, no, as a matter of fact, we're not going to sell this to you because we've dumped all of our waste here. So the city of Niagara Falls used eminent domain to allow themselves to purchase it. Hooker Chemical Company, as a way of trying to protest it, charged a total sum of $1 for this area because they had to sell it because of eminent domain. This landfill had been really poorly run. There's, as I mentioned, steel drums of chemical waste. The city and the U.S. Army stored things there. But by 1948, Hooker Chemical Company was the sole owner and dumper, and they also had been in charge of everything that was buried there. Hooker Chemical Company itself was operational until 1953. They had buried their waste at a depth of 20 to 25 feet, covered everything with soil, and grew grass on top of it, as the regulations at that point in time told them to do. In 1953, as I mentioned, it was sold to the Niagara Falls School Board for $1. When they sold it, the deed to the property contained a statement stating that the waste was there And there was a liability limitation clause about contamination that would keep anyone from being able to sue Hooker Chemical Company, or so they thought. And here's that caveat. It says that the ground contained waste products resulting from the manufacturing of chemicals, and that the grantee assumed all risk and liability incident to the use of this ground. So the person who was purchasing the ground assumed all risk and liability, letting the people who owned it and dumped material there free of everything. And that meant that no claim, no suit, or action or demand of any nature whatsoever could be made against LoveCanal or anyone that ever ended up owning LoveCanal. And they couldn't charge them for anything including death, loss or damage of property, or anything dealing with the effects of this industrial waste. So LoveCanal as a town was built in the late 1950s. It was considered a blue-collar town. They built about 100 homes at first and continued to add more, and they built a school. In the end, there ended up being around 3 schools in this general area. It's a working-class community, and they started construction on the 99th Street School, which is going to be the important school as we continue through, in January 1954. When they started construction, they realized they were building right on top of the canal, and everybody realized that was bad. So they moved about 80 to 85 feet away from the center of the canal and started doing construction there. As they started doing the construction, they broke through the seal that was on the top of the canal itself, and there was some ground rupturing problems, and they moved a little bit further away to make sure that they weren't, on top of the toxic waste that they had just disturbed. They completed building the school in 1955, and 400 children were enrolled in this elementary school. There was a playground behind the school where they ruptured through the seal on top of the toxic waste dump. And by later in 1955, a 25-foot area had crumbled down of the dirt, and during the rainstorms, they would get these puddles with some interesting colors and like an oil slick and stuff like that on top of them. But the children loved playing in the puddles like children do during a rainstorm. So we have small elementary school children being exposed to toxic chemicals in puddles when it rains out back behind the elementary school. This is an idea of what LoveCanal, the city, looked like. This is another aerial photograph, and you can see the school here in the center and the homes that are around it. And this is another way of looking at the LoveCanal area. With LoveCanal, and we're using LoveCanal as a lead up to the chapter on waste, because this is a perfect example of why we need to care about waste in the environment. So I talked a little bit about the community before, and we know that the school is built on top of this toxic waste dump, right? So when do people start complaining? Well, it actually starts in the 1950s through the 1970s that we have people complaining of odors and of liquid substances coming up in their yards. Imagine for a moment it rains, and every time it rains, you get a colorful puddle in your backyard. And are you going to be concerned? Oil colors or other colors, and it smells bad. Maybe even when it rains, your basement starts to smell bad. And not like a mildew smell, but like a chemical smell. Remember that 93rd Street had opened, or 93rd Street School had opened in 1955. By 1957 is when the low-income housing was built in this area. So we have children and low-income housing being built in the toxic waste dump. The city finds that they are going to hire a consulting firm. They're going to quiet everybody's fears. It's going to be totally fine. They found toxins in the air. They found toxins in the liquid chamber at the bottom of people's sump pumps in their homes. They found 50-gallon drums when they examined under the ground. They found high PCBs in the sewer system. The consulting firm said, this is not okay. We had you guys punctured the clay liner during construction. The toxic waste is no longer contained. The chemicals are migrating out of the canal. You should do remediation for these people, meaning that you should come in and clean everything up and remove the toxins. And the city basically said, Thank you. And they did nothing. So we have the city knowing things are happening and they're doing nothing. Then 1978, they built 800 more homes. There's 240 low-income apartments, and there's now 3 schools in this area. Most of these things were not built directly on the canal, but they were built on the surrounding area. And the people buying these properties had no idea what was buried and seeping out of the ground nearby. So then, rusty barrels start coming out of the ground. Think for a moment. You're in your backyard, and you find a piece of rusting metal barrel, 50-gallon drum barrel. Any of you going to be concerned? Chemical waste was pooling at the surface. It smells so bad in people's yards, they can classify it as a chemical smell even outdoors, and plants in their gardens start dying on a regular basis. Children are getting chemical burns from playing in puddles. There are puddles even when it's not raining. Children are getting sick. Some of them are even dying. 1962 is a wet winter and a wet spring. What do you guys know about groundwater and the way that it kind of mixes things together, right? So you've got all of this wet area with puddles of oil and colored liquids. 1977, they have heavy rains and snow, and some of the scientists talked about it as a sea of chemical mud. Puddles. Brown could be mud. Children playing in the water in the backyard. 1976, they test, oh gosh, this was great. So the people decided that their government wasn't going to do anything for them. So they know the government's not going to do anything. What do? They reach out to the reporters. They're able to get one reporter by the name of Michael Brown to really get interested in this. In 1976, the reporters agree to help test for sump pumps. And they take people's water samples, and toxic chemicals are found in their sump pumps. And if you have a sump pump in your basement, if it's an area where it's prone to flooding, you tend to have these in your basement, and it's going to take all of the water that is in the lower level of your foundation and pump it out of your house. But that sump pump is usually a 5-gallon bucket that has like a reservoir of a couple gallons in the bottom of it at all times. Can you imagine toxic chemicals sitting in your basement 24 hours a day? Michael Brown writes articles about the hazardous waste in 1978. He investigated the health effects. He did an informal door-to-door survey of people living in the area. He found birth defects and birth anomalies, including enlarged feet, heads, hands, and legs. He advised local residents to create a protest group, which was led by a woman by the name of Karen Schroeder, whose daughter had about a dozen birth defects, physical birth defects. New York State Health Department did follow suit with this investigation and found an abnormal incidence of miscarriage. The dump site was declared an unprecedented state emergency on August 2nd, 1978. Michael Brown wrote more than 100 articles on LoveCanal. He tested groundwater. He worked with consulting firms. He found that the dump site itself was 3 times larger than had ever been disclosed. And he found he was actually the first person to test and find dioxins in the chemical waste. The New York State Department of Health collected air and soil samples from homes, from the ground, from water, from the schools, and they started a health study. What they found as they were doing this is that there was a medical emergency, and eventually they did order an immediate closure of the 99th Street School built directly on top of it. But people pointed out they've got wasn't just puddles. Do you see the marks on the walls in people's basements? How many of you have had even a minor flooding in your basement? You get like a little mud maybe on the wall. This is chemicals. Chemical waste residue on the walls of their houses. The next person who really got involved is Lois Gibbs. She was a stay-at-home mom. She was elected to be the head of the LoveCanal Homeowners Association. Her son Michael had started the elementary school and kindergarten in 1977. By December of his year of kindergarten, he had developed epilepsy, which he had not had previously to starting school. He also had asthma. He had a number of urinary tract infections, a low white blood cell count, and she knew something in the school was making her son sick. Would you all agree something was making him sick? And if he'd never had these things before, you're going to blame it on the school? Now imagine your town goes, you're wrong. It's just your kid. How are you going to feel? And how are you going to feel talking to the other parents and seeing this is happening with lots of children in the school? She decided to lead an effort to investigate community concerns. She and other residents kept a log of all of their concerns, all of their complaints. She found that there was a high rate of unexplained illnesses, high rate of miscarriages, and a high rate of learning disabilities, but severe learning disabilities of the people that lived there. She noted the basements were frequently covered in thick black substances and that people's plants were dying in their yards. In most yards, the only thing that would grow were a few varieties of grass. The city officials were asked to investigate. They did, but they didn't do anything. Niagara Falls mayor stated that there was, quote, nothing wrong in LoveCanal. You can imagine soon this gets pretty interesting, right? Because we have Michael Brown publishing these stories at the same time that women, mothers and fathers as well, are saying, we're going to take on this town. She learned that the community was built on toxic waste, and she was like, yeah, we're not going to stop here. She led news conferences. She was the lead spokesperson. And she and a lot of the other people involved in the Homeowners Association spent a lot of their own money to try and help things out. But here's the thing I didn't tell you at the beginning. A lot of the people that worked in this area, that lived in this area, they couldn't just move. Because that's the first thing everyone thinks about. Why didn't they move? This is where their jobs were. Many of the people that lived here were low-income families. There was no option to pick up and move. Also, how are you going to sell your house if people come to buy your house and your lawn is dead and there's chemical smells in your backyard? No. The Homeowners Association did lots and lots of work of organization. Take a look at that picture and then think about what community meetings look like in your area. Do you usually see rooms that full? They wanted everybody involved. I don't know if you can read that sign. What does it say? Overpopulated community, combine 82, overpolluted community, combine 82 chemicals, place in barrels, and immediately place in ground in well-populated neighborhood, especially effective in a schoolyard. Sure to cut lifespans. We don't want to live here anymore, would you? People had signs like this all over their front yards. They were trying to contact news media to get people to come talk with them. But there was a problem. Disaster area, the city has failed us. The DOT assistant said on August 17, 1978, if they stay, they're signing their own death warrants. This is terrifying stuff. Politicians' solution to pollution is give them food stamps. Welcome to Rainbow City. Come to see our multicolored toxic chemicals. There was a relocation office if you could find somebody to work with you, but they weren't going to give you any money to leave. It took them a long time to get any media really interested in what they had to say. On May 18th, 1978, the New York State Health Department met with the residents. They did talk to them. This is good because the city had still refused to do anything. They knew they had to go over the mayor's head to get anything to happen. August 2nd, 1978, the New York State Health Commission declared a state of emergency, closed the 99th Street School. Pregnant women and children under 2 had to leave the immediate area. Not the whole area, just, I think it was a 2-block radius around the dump site. 1978, Jimmy Carter orders an evacuation for all the people living in the 2 rings of houses adjacent to the canal. It's August 7th. 239 families. Lois Gibbs did not live in that area, so she was not evacuated. A lot of the other people were not either. The houses were purchased by the state of New York. The families living in that 10-block area were told they were not at risk, so they did not have to leave. And that's where she lived. So it was only the school and the 2 blocks. I'll skip that for now. February 8th, 1979. Pregnant women and children from that remaining 10-block radius were told, oh yeah, you can't stay. Actually, we were wrong. It's still not safe for you. At this point in time, Lois Gibbs is not evacuated still because her son is now in, I think he was then in 2nd grade. She was not pregnant, so they didn't have to leave. September 8th, 1979, 300 more families are evacuated, including Lois Gibbs' family at this point in time, due to chemical exposure. During the time where pregnant women were being told to evacuate, or children under 2, if the woman suffered a miscarriage, she was immediately told that she had to move back. And if the child under the 2 died from health concerns, then family was told to move back. So while they were evacuating people until they were evacuated fully, if you lost that special consideration, you were sent back. Is this a public health failure in your mind, as well as a toxic dump and a social concern? And this shouldn't have happened, right? May 17th, 1980, the EPA had done blood testing on the people living in the town. The blood tests showed that the people living there had sustained chromosomal damage. What do you know about chromosomal damage? What is that linked to? Cancer. The residents were told this meant they had a high risk of cancer, high risk of reproductive problems, and a high risk of genetic damage to their future children. On May 19th, 1980, they'd had it. EPA still had people in town, and the LoveCanal residents told the government that they wanted action. They wanted their families relocated. They want the governments to pay for it. And when they were told that wasn't going to happen, they took the EPA representatives hostage. They took them into their houses and into their meeting spaces, and they kept them. And they refused to allow them to leave. This made the news. Shocking, isn't it? This makes the news. So, the LoveCanal families told the White House then, in response to the fact that they'd taken the EPA federal government representatives hostage, they were like, fine, tell the White House we want to be relocated by May 21st. They took them hostage on May 19th. We want to be relocated by May 21st at noon. Or, quote, what we've done here today will look like a Sesame Street picnic compared to what we'll do then. And that was the statement from Lois Gibbs that she gave from the microphone when they allowed her to speak. What do you think happened? May 21st, President Carter's like, you guys can move. Please, yes, we will help you move. Absolutely. It took until October 1st for President Carter to visit Niagara Falls and to sign the appropriation bill that funded permanent relocation for any of the 900 families that wished to leave. When did I say people started complaining about things? 1950s, right? And it takes until 1980 to get the government to say, yes, please, we're going to help you move. Hooker Chemical Company gets mad. They start taking out full-page ads in newspapers all over the country because they don't want to be blamed. It's not their fault. They sold the property. They're printing their caveat and all sorts of other things, full-page ads talking about how this is destroying their rights because they don't want to be responsible. I'm going to pause there. Are they responsible? The guy in that picture who's mad and angry because his job is being put at risk because he works at Hooker Chemical Company, is he responsible? I've seen a lot of you go, no. Is the chemical company itself responsible? Maybe. Is this a failure of the government to regulate what we do with wastes and what needs to happen in order to build houses in an area where wastes have been disposed of? Is the city itself mainly the one at fault for having used eminent domain to purchase the area knowing that there was a risk? There is a resolution. In 1983, things finally get settled at a cost of about $20 million in 1983 dollars. Department of Health concludes that portions of LoveCanal in 1988, after they've been remediated, are as habitable as other areas of Niagara Falls. When pressed if these areas were safe, they kept repeating that they're as habitable as other areas of Niagara Falls because they can't declare them safe. Okay, you guys are pretty smart. Are they safe?
What does it say about other areas of Niagara Falls?
Right?
That was safe as the bottom of the falls, like building a house.
Right. Well, because they came out and said it was habitable, it meant that people started buying the property and building new houses. Come on, you knew this was going to happen. So on August 15th, the LoveCanal Revitalization Agency renamed LoveCanal Black Creek Village and announced that 9 new homes were up for sale. By November 28th of 1990, the first new family had moved into LoveCanal. But further efforts to sell homes kind of slowed because Lois Gibson, the EPA administrator, tried to block the resettlement of this area. By 1992, the Federal Housing Administration agreed to provide mortgage insurance to families who wanted to purchase homes in what had been LoveCanal. By September 1992, the 93 Street School was demolished. In 1994, Occidental Petroleum, who at that point in time had purchased Hooker Chemical and a couple of the other things, agreed to pay $98 million to cover the cost of cleanup to the state of New York and the federal government. By 1998, a playground had been built on the portion of the neighborhood that was not habitable and could not have the school built on it. The Superfund Act, which is actually the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA, was passed in part because of what happened with LoveCanal. And because of LoveCanal, it contained a retroactive liability provision, which allowed the government to hold responsible people who had done things in the past that destroyed an area. Even though at those times people had followed the applicable U.S. laws, it still allows them to retroactively penalize. You can go to LoveCanal today, and you can see the areas behind the fence that look the same as when the people fled it in the 80s. People haven't gone back. You can see the signs in people's front yards still sitting there. You've probably seen on the news whenever there's a hurricane approaching, the people put the plywood up and like write things on like spray paint on the plywood on their windows. You see that in some of the houses here. And it's strange because you feel like you're looking at a ghost town out of the 1970s and 1980s. Some of the houses are a lot worse. Some people just left things as they went, and the trash is still there in their front lawns because people. But now we have Black Creek Village, a model community sponsored by the LoveCanal Area Revitalization Agency. Anyone going to live there? What if I paid you to live there? Still not going to live there. What if I paid you $5 million to live there? None of you are still going to live there. Tasha might. What's in there? 248 different chemicals. 11 suspected and known carcinogens. 130 pounds of dioxin alone was recovered. Barrels of Agent Orange. Chlorinated compounds, benzyls, benzenes, metal chlorides, toluene, PCB, methyl chloride, you name it, it was there. Dioxin was found in the water there at 53 parts per billion, which is lethal, close to lethal. And many of the chemicals got into the water, and then as the water evaporated, oh, this is a horrible picture. Let me try seeing if the lights make it better. Do you see the barrels coming up out of the ground? That's what these are supposed to be pictures of. That is an area where they uncovered barrels that were still intact. In other areas, as they dug, all they found were barrels that had partially disintegrated. So remediation. Remediation is the process through which we attempt to make an area healthy again that has been destroyed. You're removing all of the waste, usually sending it someplace else for safe disposal, and then bringing in other materials to fill the area to build things back on. Well, if you can. If it's not possible, you're not going to do remediation. You're just going to close off an area. And they implied both approaches here. So for remediation, they tore down a lot of homes. Most of the schools were torn down. 90 of the original 900 families did eventually stay or came back. The LoveCanal Area Revitalization Agency is the one that purchased, rehabbed, and sold the homes that were safe. The 16-acre toxic area, after they removed everything, had a thick plastic liner and then clay dirt put back over things with 2.5 meter high barbed wire fence around the whole outside to keep people out. So today, there's still a chain link fence with yellow warning signs around the areas that are not safe. Everything's just as it was. In these areas that are closed off, the hazardous waste is still there. It's still in the ground, it's still in the groundwater, it's still in the homes. There are people living nearby that don't really know what's there, but it's their own kind of risk. But because of it, in part because of it, we got the Superfund Act. And there are people, if you talked to them, to know that this meant, that what they went through meant that other families won't have to go through that. They might tell you that it was worth it. Horrible for their family, or at least that there was a silver lining to know that other families around the country are not going to have to deal with what they had to deal with. It's not an isolated case, though. We expect that there's hundreds of similar sites in the United States. Any of you know if there's a Superfund site in your town? There was one in my town. It's a couple blocks away from where I live. There was one a couple houses down from where my dad grew up. In both of those situations, one was a scientist, the other was a doctor, that both brought home rather toxic things. The one worked with radioactive waste, but he worked with it before we understood that it was radioactive stuff was bad, and he would bring things home and store them in his basement. So his whole house was radioactive. The other one worked with mercury, and would bring home liquid mercury and play with it at home and spill it in his basement and things. So they had to rehab those areas under Superfund. But most sites are probably not this LoveCanal bad. Some of them are. We know that when they interviewed most people, they said they wouldn't have moved there if they'd known about the chemicals. And just the fact that people know. One of the things that I cover in environmental regulation policy is dealing with the community right to know about what is there and what is happening in your community. The other horrible thing they learned is the chemical companies change hands a lot. It's hard to track down who's responsible because they're constantly selling off different portions of themselves to other companies. And school districts should not try to find the lowest cost way to educate their students. They bought the property for $1 to build some schools on. So the LoveCanal, when it was being developed, their advertising jingle was, if you get there before I do, tell them I'm a coming to see the things so wondrous true as LoveCanal's new model city. That was like their little tagline. But one of the signs that was the most popular one that was in a lot of the press from LoveCanal was the one that said, give me liberty, I've already gotten death. It's an interesting contrast. Those two things. There's some resources there if you want to look at them. There's a lot more I can recommend.